There were dramatic scenes of violence and political unrest in Thailand today as soldiers opened fire on anti-government protesters. The demonstrators, who support the country's former Prime Minister and are demanding fresh elections, retaliated by setting fire to buses and throwing petrol bombs. At least one person was killed and more than 90 people were injured in the upheaval. The BBC's Alistair Leithhead reports on today's violence from Bangkok.
Fires burned on the streets of Bangkok as the army were finally sent in to break up the anti-government protests. They came early and reclaimed a main road blocked by the red-shirted demonstrators. The protesters came prepared for a confrontation after taking control of a large section of the city centre. But the army was also prepared. And as it became more tense, they brought in backup, heavily armed reinforcements. Petrol bombs, rocks and bottles from the protesters, harmless explosions from the military to try and scare the crowd away. But as a bus was set on fire, the troops moved. This was enough provocation for the rules to suddenly change.
Well, suddenly the army started opening fire with live rounds. They were trying to shoot above, but some of those bullets were being fired into the crowds. It scarpered the red shirts who've gone down here, and the military are now following them. They're firing down this alleyway just down here as well.
Then behind us, the protesters drove another bus at the troops. It started clashes on a second front. The red shirts were driven away. There were some serious injuries. The focus then turned to Government House, the red stronghold. It's been a day of chaos in Bangkok since the military came out onto the streets in the early hours of the morning. These are the barricades put up by the protesters to protect Government House, the area where the focus of their protest is now centred. After dark, the locals turned on them, their momentum perhaps starting to stall. As the troops sat a short distance away, waiting for their chance to restore order. But at what cost will it come? Alistair Leithhead, BBC News, Bangkok.
The protesters behind today's demonstrations are supporters of the former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, who was ousted 3 years ago in a military coup. But despite accusations of corruption and abuse of power, Mr. Thaksin remains a very popular figure in the country, and today he called for a peaceful revolution. The BBC's Jonathan Head has a look at the background to today's protests.
In Thailand, you have the Reds and the Yellows. Both groups have brought governments to their knees in recent years. Many of the Reds love this man, Thaksin Shinawatra, a brash self-made billionaire who won 2 record election victories by promising and delivering well-marketed policies that helped the rural poor. For the first time, farmers and labourers who'd missed out on Thailand's economic boom believed there was a party that represented them. They are the bedrock of the red shirt movement today.
I just would like to give them moral support. I never instigate them, but I want them to fight to get the true democracy. We've been fighting for many years. The poor cannot be cannot get help, and then during my administration, the poor feel like, you know, the democracy is really mean to them.
But Mr. Thaksin's impassioned followers have now gone too far, says the current Prime Minister.
Any complaints about the current state of democracy or constitution, we are happy to deal with. We want an inclusive political reform. We invite the opposition, but we are not going to allow violence and intimidation and breaking of laws to be the norm in Thailand.
It was Mr. Thaksin's autocratic style that alienated many wealthier Thais. 3 years ago, they launched huge demonstrations dressed in yellow, the king's colour, culminating in a military coup that forced Mr. Thaksin from office. And when his allies returned to power again last year, the yellow shirts came back, dramatically occupying the international airport and bringing down the pro-Thaksin government. Prime Minister Abhisit Vejjajiva owes his job to the actions of the yellow shirts, even as he struggled to repair Thailand's battered economy and its international reputation. The red shirts say that's why he has no right to govern. Jonathan Head, BBC News, Bangkok.